April 29th, 1975, Saigon, South Vietnam, 4:58 in the morning. A radio station begins broadcasting a specific weather report. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. Then, Bing Crosby's White Christmas plays on the radio. This is not a weather report. This is not a Christmas song. This is the signal. Every American in Saigon who hears it knows exactly what it means. Get to your evacuation point. Now. The war is over. To understand what happens on April 29th, 1975, you need to understand the 10 years that came before it. The United States had been fighting in Vietnam, in one form or another, since the early 1960s. At the peak of American involvement in 1969, more than 500,000 American military personnel were in South Vietnam. They had fought in jungles and rice paddies, on fire bases and in city streets, in the air and on the rivers. They had lost more than 58,000 dead. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 had ended direct American military involvement. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. A small force of military advisors and embassy personnel remained, along with CIA operatives and contractors. But the war between North and South Vietnam did not end. It continued, and through 1974 and into 1975, it began to go very badly for the South. In March 1975, the North Vietnamese army launched a massive offensive. South Vietnamese forces, which had been fighting with diminishing American support for 2 years, began to collapse. Cities fell in rapid succession: Hue, Da Nang, Quien Hon, Nha Trang. In Washington, the Ford administration watched the situation deteriorate and debated the pace of evacuation. In Saigon, Ambassador Graham Martin, who had lost a son in the Vietnam War and who believed that the South could still survive if American support continued, delayed the evacuation of American personnel and Vietnamese allies far longer than military commanders believed was prudent. By late April 1975, North Vietnamese forces were at the gates of Saigon. The city held approximately 6 million people, among them thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with Americans, who had served as interpreters, as intelligence operatives, as military officers trained by American advisors, people who had every reason to fear what would happen to them when the North Vietnamese army entered the city. American evacuation planning had originally assumed that fixed-wing aircraft would be used, that Tan Son Nhut Air Base would remain operational long enough to fly out the people who needed to leave. On April 28th, that assumption was destroyed. NVA aircraft, South Vietnamese A-37 jets, captured at Da Nang and flown by defecting South Vietnamese pilots working for the North, attacked Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The runway was damaged. Fixed-wing evacuation was over. It would have to be helicopters. Operation Frequent Wind was activated. On April 29th, beginning in the early morning hours, U.S. Marine and Navy helicopters began the most massive helicopter evacuation in history. The primary evacuation points were the U.S. Embassy compound in central Saigon and the Defense Attaché Office compound at Tan Son Nhut. The scene at the embassy was unlike anything that had been planned for. Thousands of Vietnamese crowded outside the embassy walls, desperately trying to get inside. They had worked with Americans. They had intelligence files that would mark them for arrest. Or worse, when the North Vietnamese arrived, they had children who had never known anything but South Vietnam. They pressed against the gates and the walls, holding up papers, calling out the names of Americans they knew. The Marine guards at the embassy gates faced an impossible situation. They were under orders: prioritize American citizens, then certain categories of Vietnamese. But the people on the other side of the gate were not strangers. They were people the guards and the diplomats inside knew. Translators, drivers, local employees who had served the embassy for years. The decisions made at those gates on April 29, 1975, who to let through, who to hold back, who to turn away, are decisions that the people who made them have carried for the rest of their lives. Inside the embassy compound, a tamarind tree in the parking area had become an obstacle to helicopter landings. Ambassador Martin, who had delayed the evacuation so long, was present when the decision was made to cut it down. The chainsaw that took down the tamarind tree has become one of the small symbols of the day, the physical act of destroying something established and permanent to enable the departure. Helicopters came in through the day and into the night. CH-46 Sea Knights, CH-53 Sea Stallions, UH-1 Hueys, landing in the embassy parking area and on the roof of the Chancery building, loading as many people as possible, lifting off under air traffic control that was managing dozens of simultaneous sorties. Offshore, the aircraft carriers and amphibious ships of Task Force 76 waited. USS Midway, USS Hancock, USS Okinawa. The decks that were normally crowded with fixed-wing aircraft had been partially cleared to receive the evacuation helicopters. The helicopters flew, and flew, and flew. Pilots who had flown since before dawn were still flying 16 hours later. The helicopters landed, unloaded, refueled when possible, took off again. The cycle repeated until the pilots could barely keep their eyes open and the deck crews were working in a fog of exhaustion. Something was happening on the ships that nobody had planned for. South Vietnamese Air Force pilots, men who had been fighting alongside Americans for years, whose country was falling around them, who faced an unknown future if they stayed, were flying their own aircraft out to the fleet. Hueys, Chinooks, O-1 bird dogs, Vietnamese pilots landing on American ships without authorization, without communication in some cases, just landing because the ships were there and the alternative was to stay. The decks were filling up. To make room for the evacuation helicopters, the ones carrying the people who were being brought out of Saigon, the South Vietnamese aircraft had to go. Over the side, American sailors pushed South Vietnamese helicopters into the South China Sea. Millions of dollars of military equipment sinking into the water to make deck space for the next load of refugees. The Vietnamese pilots watched their aircraft go over the side. They had nowhere else to go. They stayed on the ships. Back in Saigon, the night wore on. At the embassy, the crowd outside the walls had not diminished. More people arrived as word spread that this was the last chance, that the helicopters were still coming, that there might still be a way out. There was not enough time. There were not enough helicopters. There were not enough hours before the North Vietnamese army would be in the city. The decisions about who could be brought out and who could not, decisions made on April 29th and the early hours of April 30th, are studied in ethics courses and written about in memoirs by the people who made them. There are no clean answers. Ambassador Martin finally agreed to leave the embassy in the early hours of April 30th. He had to be told, essentially, that the decision was no longer his to make. He boarded a helicopter carrying the American flag that had flown over the embassy. The last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, 1975. 11 Marines, the last of the embassy guard detachment, were aboard. Below them, on the embassy roof, were several hundred Vietnamese who had been told they would be evacuated, who had been told to wait, who had waited through the night. The helicopter did not come back for them. In the chaos of the final hours, in the communication failures, and the time pressure, and the exhaustion of the pilots and the crews, they were left behind. This is the most painful part of Operation Frequent Wind. Not the physical danger. The operation was conducted with remarkably few American casualties. Not the logistical achievement. The evacuation of approximately 7,000 people by helicopter in 18 hours remains one of the most impressive military aviation operations ever conducted. The most painful part is the people who were not evacuated. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Vietnamese who had worked directly with Americans, translators, intelligence officers, military personnel, local employees, were not evacuated before the North Vietnamese army entered Saigon. Many of them were sent to re-education camps. Some were imprisoned for years. Some did not survive. This is the weight that the diplomats and military officers who planned and executed the evacuation carry. They saved thousands. They could not save everyone. At 11:30 a.m. on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese Army Tank 843 crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace, the presidential palace of South Vietnam. A North Vietnamese officer climbed to the roof and raised the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. The Vietnam War was over. In the United States, the images from April 29th and 30th, the crowds at the embassy walls, the helicopters lifting off the roof, the South Vietnamese aircraft going over the sides of American ships, became the defining visual record of how the war ended. For the Americans who had fought in Vietnam, the ones who had come home, the ones who had waited for years for the war to end in some form, the images were complicated. The war had not ended the way anyone had wanted. But for the helicopter pilots who had flown 16-hour days, for the Marines who had held the embassy perimeter, for the sailors who had pushed aircraft into the sea to make room for refugees, for the Americans who had made impossible decisions at embassy gates, they had done what they could. In 18 hours of helicopter operations, they had brought out approximately 7,000 people. The tamarind tree was gone. The flag was down. The last helicopter had lifted off the embassy roof, and somewhere in the South China Sea, South Vietnamese helicopters were settling into the water, while the pilots who had flown them waited on American ships for whatever came next. This is how the Vietnam War ended, not with a treaty, not with a victory ceremony, with a code word on the radio in the early morning. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, and Bing Crosby singing White Christmas to a city that was already gone. Next week on Lost Patrol, we go back to the beginning, the battle that started it all for American forces in Vietnam. Operation Starlight, August 1965, the first major American offensive ground operation of the Vietnam War, and what it revealed about the war that would follow. Subscribe to Lost Patrol so you don't miss it. If this video changed how you think about how the Vietnam War ended, hit that like button. 2 seconds. It tells the algorithm, this story deserves to be heard. This is Lost Patrol. The battles they never found. There is something specific about Operation Frequent Wind that does not appear in most accounts of the evacuation. The radio operators on the ships offshore were monitoring Vietnamese military frequencies throughout April 29th and 30th. What they heard in the hours before the North Vietnamese entered Saigon was South Vietnamese military units that had been fighting alongside Americans for years, trying to reach American command, asking for ammunition resupply, asking for artillery support, asking for airstrikes. The answers they received, when they received answers at all, explained that American direct support was no longer authorized under the terms of the Paris Peace Accords and subsequent congressional restrictions on military involvement in Southeast Asia. The South Vietnamese units that were still fighting continued to fight until they ran out of ammunition. Some of them fought until April 30th. The last organized South Vietnamese resistance was not in Saigon. It was at Xuan Loc, a city 30 miles east of Saigon, where the 18th ARVN Division had held an NVA assault for 12 days in early April, fighting outnumbered and without the support that would have been available 2 years earlier. They held for 12 days. Then the division, what was left of it, fought its way out rather than surrender. Most of the men dispersed into the countryside. Their story, like many stories from the final days of the Vietnam War, remains incompletely told. The war ended on April 30th, 1975. For the United States, it ended with helicopters and a flag and a Bing Crosby song on the radio. For the South Vietnamese, who had fought alongside Americans for a decade, it ended differently. Some made it onto ships. Some made it onto the last helicopters. Some got onto boats and sailed into international waters hoping for rescue. Many did not get out. The full accounting of what happened to the South Vietnamese, who worked with Americans and were not evacuated, remains, in many respects, unfinished. Operation Frequent Wind evacuated approximately 7,000 people. The city of Saigon had 6 million. This is the mathematics of how the Vietnam War ended. This is what the radio code and the Bing Crosby song meant. This is what the tamarind tree falling in the embassy compound meant. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, White Christmas, and the last helicopter lifting off into the morning sky. The pilots who flew on April 29th and 30th, 1975, the men who sat in helicopter cockpits for 16 hours, who made approach after approach into a city that was falling, who calculated fuel loads and passenger weights, while the radios filled with voices. Most of them came home to a country that did not celebrate what they had done. The Vietnam War was not a celebration. Its ending was not a celebration. The helicopters lifting off the embassy roof were not images of triumph, but they were images of something real. Men doing a dangerous job under impossible conditions. A fleet of helicopters that flew until the pilots could barely function. Deck crews that worked through the night. Sailors who pushed South Vietnamese aircraft into the ocean with their hands to make room for the next load of refugees. The Marine Guards who held the embassy perimeter while the last people were loaded. These are not stories of a war won. They are stories of people doing what they could at the end of something that had already been decided. In the years that followed, the helicopter crews who flew Operation Frequent Wind received little recognition for what they had accomplished. The operation was overshadowed by the context in which it occurred. The fall of Saigon, the end of the American involvement in Vietnam, the images of defeat that defined how the country processed the end of the war. It took decades for the full scope of what was accomplished on April 29th and 30th to be properly recognized. 7,000 people evacuated in 18 hours by helicopter, in a city surrounded by an army that was closing in from all sides, with pilots who had been flying since before dawn and would fly until after dark. This is Operation Frequent Wind. This is how the Vietnam War ended for the United States. And this is why it belongs on Lost Patrol. The battles they never found, the evacuations they never talked about, the people who were there,